Just a quick note to everyone out there. There's a free webinar coming up, and I think you should check it out. It's called Everyday AI for Compliance Teams, and it's being hosted by our sponsor, Hummingbird, on June 25th. It's a practical look at how investigators are using Hummingbird's AI tools to work more efficiently. Things like reducing repetitive tasks, speeding up casework, and writing clearer, more consistent narratives. Why? Because the goal of compliance AI isn't to replace judgment, it's to give you more time to use it. That's all happening Wednesday, June 25th at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. And you can register at hummingbird.co/illicit edge. Again, that's hummingbird.co/illicit edge. Hey, viewers and listeners, glad to have you here, back with Coercive Capital. Today's episode is focused on Iran. And since we recorded this on June 18th, and today is June 23rd, things have progressed. The U.S. is now involved in the war, and it's unclear what will be happening next. We may see some sort of a deal if President Trump's tweets foretell something that may be coming soon. I wanted to just make sure that you knew about this delay in recording so that you can take the discussion in context. Much of what we talk about is even more relevant than it was last week, but it's always good to put things in context. So thanks for listening. Welcome back, Coercive Capital viewers and listeners. After a brief hiatus, it's great to be back bringing you podcast content on the Illicit Edge Network. And today, we're going to talk about Iran. And we are joined by one of the smartest people analyzing Iran today, Behnam Ben Taleblu. Behnam is Senior Director of the Iran Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he's also a senior fellow, a colleague of mine, wonderful guy. He's also a member of the Anti-Defamation League's task force on the Middle East minorities and a contributing editor to the National Security Journal. Behnam examines Iran from just about every geopolitical angle you can imagine, from nuclear nonproliferation, ballistic missiles and drones, sanctions, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its proxies, the foreign and security policy of the Islamic Republic, and more. So I can't imagine a more relevant person to speak with during this current moment and to discuss the evolving situation in the Middle East. So thank you, Behnam, for joining the podcast. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Elaine. Great to be with you, and thanks for the very kind intro.
Oh, thanks. Well, things are changing as we speak. So I thought what we should do is walk through some of the latest developments on the Israeli-Iran conflict and, kind of get the lay of the land as of today. And I just wanted to kind of throw out there that it's nothing short of incredible that as of a few days ago, Israel effectively controls the Iranian airspace, which is pretty shocking, even for folks who I follow who are, like you, really focused on Iran. So what do you see unfolding at the moment, and how would you summarize what's happened over the last 5 to 6 days since Israel attacked Iran's nuclear weapon sites and focused on eliminating some of the key leadership within their nuclear program?
Well, I think the word historic is absolutely right. I'm going to butcher this Lenin quote of all people, where I think he said there's decades where nothing happens and there's weeks where decades happen. We are less than a week, as you mentioned, about 6 days into this overt Israel-Iran shooting war. And, make no mistake, it is a war. There's missiles flying, there's cyber stuff, there's misinformation, there's control of cyberspace as well as the airspace. This is the shadow war that we've seen between the Islamic Republic, Iran, and Israel briefly come out of the shadows in 2024 and now stay there, conventional, outright, overt in 2025. And what you've seen the Israelis do, based on reporting, based on video, based on social media, based on official statements, is basically deracinate the military brain trust of the Islamic Republic of Iran, as well as a whole host of Iranian nuclear scientists. They're going after the intellectual capital, the political capital that has actually made a regime like the Islamic Republic be able to last for so long. The reason I say this is because while all the Israeli strikes on Iranian military bases in the West, as well as now in the center, and then even last weekend at one site all the way in the northeast of Iran, showing how much range and control they could have over Iranian airspace, while all of that matters from a military perspective, politically, the Israelis already knew they were fighting an adversary who was conventionally weaker than them, but to benefit maximally from that delta, they were also striking with the element of surprise. And while it's not a surprise because Israel and America have been saying for many years, I think really since the post 9/11 years, that all options were on the table. And really, 2024 was a historic year, showed the regime's weaknesses limping into 2025, economically, environmentally, politically, militarily. It was not a shock that Israel would be able to see that the regime was at its lowest point, perhaps its lowest point ever since the end of the Iran-Iraq War, but to really have the gumption to capitalize on that and capitalize on that with something that was not as much reported, but which was a something that led to their post-October successes in the wars closer to home for the Israelis, which was the intelligence fights and the intelligence networks that they helped create. I mean, inside of Iran, the Israelis today have a drone base. They're firing on Iran from Iranian territory. So merging this inside and outside game, merging this defense against Iranian missiles plus this offensive ground game on the ground with drones against these production sites and against these launch sites has really led to the restricted room for maneuver of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and in even forcing the Iranians into doing things that they may not necessarily do and may not want to do, and into predicaments, between use or lose. For example, the Iranians are now firing ballistic missiles from deeper within Iranian territory, which means they have to rely on a series of potentially older ballistic missiles, which admittedly have heavier warheads. So if they land in Israel, the impact is bigger, but the interception likelihood is also much greater. Also, you're just forcing the Iranians into this use or lose mentality, because the Iranians for many years had a quantitative missile advantage against the Israelis, but with the interceptions as well as the left of launch strikes, the capability for the Iranians to act on this quantitative advantage continues to diminish. So you're seeing not just attacks on missiles, but also attacks on launchers. So you could have the biggest arsenal in the world, and not just the Middle East, but if you don't have a launcher, you can't really get from point A to point B. So the Israelis have attacked the logistics and the command and control network, and then they're also doing some politically symbolic targeting of critical infrastructure that says that they could really scale this up to be a major energy war, as well as also to be able to go after the regime's nuclear sites. Because lest we forget, the big backdrop for this was to stop the Islamic Republic of Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. And actually there, if one is going to be more critical, beyond obviously the fact that any war, unfortunately, does indeed have civilian casualties, and imposing civilian casualties on any population is lamentable and is very sad and lamentable. It is especially tragic in this case because you actually have in the Iranian population the most pro-American, the most even pro-Israeli population, and how to fight the war against the regime kinetically now without losing that will be a challenge for the Israelis, while also defining success as tactically and technically as possible by trying to go after all of their nuclear program. And there's some sites where they still may need more help. And that's why all eyes really right now are on America. What will America do? Will America more formally enter this conflict? Will it go against the regime leadership, which the president has been intonating on social media that he might, or will they go for a more limited counter-nuclear mission? Can the U.S. do it? Do they have to do that in conjunction with the U.S. and the Israelis? So there's a lot more questions than answers here, but that's really a tour de force of what is going on.
Excellent. Well, there's a lot to dig into here, so thank you for that, framing that up so beautifully. One thing that really struck me about what happened over the weekend and the surprise of the Israeli attack, the fusion of technology and intelligence networks, the ability to pinpoint locations and people with of interest within Iran, to do so, very strategically, very cleanly. It's a completely different game than thinking back to the attacks of October 7th and how much of a surprise that was for the Israelis. And that got me thinking about the issue of Iran's proxies. And, it's been kind of quiet from Hamas, Hezbollah. What's that about? And what should we be expecting from Iran's proxies in the region? Who maybe are trying to reassess what their role is going forward, but it is interesting that it's just been really quiet.
It's been really quiet, and again, that is by design. It may be a question of when Hezbollah may enter, but if you had to be betting at this point in time, Hezbollah won't, or is thus far trying to delay its entry as much as possible. I mean, this constellation of terror proxies and partners you mentioned, the Islamic Republic calls this the axis of resistance. And the post October 7 Middle East was not an easy place to be for the axis of resistance, even though the Islamic Republic thought that by incrementally turning on a multi front war against the Israelis, it could attrite the Israelis, bait and bleed them into longer conflicts that they're not well suited to fight, try to force the Israelis to divide their resources, expend forces, deal with political issues at home and abroad, while fighting these more asymmetric hybrid kinds of military operations. But ultimately, when it comes to Hezbollah in the south, Hezbollah in the north, in Lebanon, and Hamas in the south in Gaza, the Israelis were immensely successful, both from a military perspective as well as from an intelligence perspective. And that neutering and gutting of Iran's transnational terrorist apparatus left two other elements: the Houthis, which for 2 months you saw the U.S. battle and try to render to the sidelines, as well as the Shia militias in Iraq, which have thus far largely been quiet. Even in the post October 7 Middle East, they have been firing at Israel, but nowhere at the volume that they had been firing at the Americans. And even at the Americans, the volume ebbed and flowed compared to 2019 levels of counter max pressure, counter post Soleimani highs for these Iran-backed terror groups. So one reason the Israelis may have seen that now was an opportune time to strike was the weakness of some of these groups. And when you look at Iranian strategy more broadly, the regime is a regime obsessed with deterrence. It's really overlearned the lessons of deterrence from the Iran-Iraq War. And this is a small tangent, but every threat we face from the regime in the military world, whether that's, again, transnational terrorism and militias and proxies, or ballistic missiles, or drones, or, for example, maritime aggression. These were things that we saw, and even the nuclear program, by the way. These were things that we saw during the Iran-Iraq War raise their head. That was the incubation period for these threats, and then post-Iran-Iraq War, they were scaled up over time and integrated. And you've seen the Israelis understand that the deterrent functions of these things: maritime aggression, the U.S. had been dealing with. Ballistic missiles, the Israelis and the Americans had been intercepting most, but not all, of those missile strikes in 2024. And then transnational terrorism was down. So it really had opened the way for the Israelis to have the cleanest possible shot against the heart of the regime itself, because this deterrent architecture had really collapsed. The only area that it had not collapsed, and in fact, all the eggs had been doubled down in that basket. And that's why you saw, particularly post October 7, a whole host of Iranian statements designed to take into account the evolving missile capability, but cognizant of the adversary's evolving ballistic missile defenses, as well as cognizance of the weakness of that transnational terror force. The fact that Hamas leaders are gone, Hezbollah leaders are gone, much of the Hezbollah arsenal is gutted. The fact that even with the ceasefire in place in 2025, the Israelis are able to still push back against Hezbollah, and still there's no Hezbollah rocket volleys or drones or anti-tank weapons coming back at them, and it isn't causing some kind of major political issue, even with central authorities in Beirut, some of whom are happy to see these strikes continue. So the Israelis realized that they had a really clean shot, and that the proxy issue could be much more easily managed if you disconnected the dots of it from its patron. And this, I think, explains why the regime's axis of resistance isn't really resisting today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So these regional dynamics are complicated. But one other question that came to my mind is how the fall of the Assad regime in Syria impacted how all of this unfolded.
Well, the Assad regime in Syria, we have to always remember, was the sole state ally of the Islamic Republic in the region. The Islamic Republic really does have a transnational vision, but it doesn't really have a whole host of international partners. Yes, the regime is part of this axis of aggressors. But again, even there are issues bilaterally between each country, and there's different equities, there's historical enmity. The real overlap there is political, not necessarily military and economic. And when it comes to the Assad regime occupied a really critical piece of geography in the Middle East that allowed the regime to erect and sustain a land bridge from Iran through Iraq into Syria and then to the Eastern Mediterranean through Lebanon. And this basically was a highway that men, money, and munitions flew that supplemented the air bridge that allowed Iran to basically use civilian airliners to ferry also men, money, and munitions to conflict zones. And it was a permissive environment and a launch pad and a measure of the regime's forward defense strategy that allowed them to really have a whole host of fights, have a whole host of wars far away from their territory. It doesn't mean that the Assad regime over the years didn't try to hedge. Every 10 years they went in one direction or another direction, but broadly, strategically, politically, they were always aligned with the Iranian camp. And it was really through the Assad regime that Iran got to be able to create and control Lebanese Hezbollah in neighboring Lebanon. And when you remove, as the Israelis have done, slowly gutting the Iranian basing infrastructure with strikes since 2013 and stepping up in 2015 against Iranian positions in Syria. And then, much more importantly, when you remove Hezbollah from the equation, which had entered the Syrian civil war in 2013 to bail out the Assad regime, you actually had the political space and the military space for the collapse of, Turkey-backed and Al-Qaeda-linked militias and terror groups to come in as rapidly as they did in the winter of 2024. So the Iranians have been losing on a whole host of fronts here. And again, if you're an Israeli decision maker and you realize your advantage is a conventional military advantage that can be bolstered by a series of short, sharp strikes married with a great intel capability, when you see this, again, this entire architecture dissipating that your adversary had created, you press and push the advantage. And I think that explains Israeli decision making today, as well as the predicament Iranian decision makers find themselves in.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, that's a good segue to discussion on what might be on the negotiating table. So, the Trump administration has called for, Trump himself has called for unconditional surrender of the Iranian regime. It appears unlikely that the regime will take him up on that. But if you could kind of put your crystal ball out in front of us here, what do you think a negotiation might look like in light of Iran's dwindling number of cards to play? Is there even a need for a negotiation? What should all of this look like in terms of the diplomatic conversation, particularly over the next few weeks?
You mentioned the word diplomatic, and the problem is that there hasn't really been a diplomatic ground game, and with respect, there hasn't even really been political thought for the day after. That doesn't even necessarily mean regime change. That means about how you can politically maximize your cards to take advantage of this crumbling infrastructure in a way that is not just military, or that does not always just have to be military. I mean, again, the Israelis have paved the pathway to make the case now in the Middle East that you can finally begin to deal with Iranian military threats in a military manner. But Iran's strongest cards right now, if you're thinking about regime survival, if you're thinking about buying space and creating time to reconstitute what's left of the nuclear program, about putting up barriers to entry for American involvement, those cards are not military. Those cards are political. And being able to understand the Iranian political game requires understanding how the Iranians negotiate. Now, this is an ideological regime that for 40 plus years, for 46 years, has consistently preferenced, when put to the choice macroeconomically or militarily, guns over butter. So if that is going to be the case, it's all about restricting the revenue and restricting the political space for them to continue to pursue said gun. So if you have an adversary in this world, it's about, and they're intent on fighting you, no matter how weak they are, then it's all about making sure that they are fighting, but with one hand tied behind their back. And Negotiations here, I think, are consistent with the way the Trump administration has made sense of the threats that he believes Iran presents to U.S. interests and U.S. security. At the top of those is a potential nuclear weapon. And, the president has been remarkably consistent when he said, he doesn't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon. And, even before he entered office in term one, when he was campaigning, he said, I think I buy bad deals, I make them good deals. In this world, what the president may see is that Israeli military power could be the means for an American diplomatic end. And that's why I think the steady stream of commentary, some helpful, some unhelpful, on social media like X and whatever the other applications are, the names escape me, um, is all about creating confusion for the Iranians about what American potential aims are, if they will enter the conflict, if they're not, if this will be military, if this will be political. But I think they're designed to broadly signal to Khamenei, dismantle the program, aka through negotiations, or die, or dismantle the program, or watch it and potentially your regime be dismantled before your very eyes. These are the choices Trump is trying to, present to the Iranians, I think, in terms of how he's negotiating without already negotiating. And again, cognizant of how weak the regime is, this is actually when the regime actually excels. Because if we face these threats by virtue of the regime being in power and being an ideological regime, this is how they actually stay in power despite being weaker. This is how the Iran-Iraq War ended, when they realized that there was no way out but through. The predecessor of Ayatollah Khomeini, the founding father of the Islamic Republic, the predecessor of Ayatollah Khamenei, who was Ayatollah Khomeini, the names sound very familiar and similar. Um, when he ended the Iran-Iraq War, he likened accepting a UN ceasefire that he had rejected for a while to being akin to drinking from a poisoned chalice. So the real strategy question is, how can you get Khamenei to take the knee to drink from the poisoned chalice? And it is by continuing the military squeeze, by dangling the threat of American involvement, and making sure the Ayatollah sees no way out but through. What I would push back on that is are you sure you want to offer this regime an off ramp? Because while the debate in DC, really since the end of the Bush 2 administration, has been what kind of force posture do we need in the region when Americans want to consistently be doing less, not more in the region, the only long term way to address that, instead of promising one thing and then having to get sucked back in, like Obama and Bush and Biden had to be when it came to a whole host of other threats in the Middle East, while balancing great power competition and pivoting and rebalancing to Asia, is by flipping the script on the Ayatollahs. And that actually could be where a potential regime change option actually is the thing that allows you to push away from the Middle East. If you flip the script on the Ayatollahs, you have turned off the fire on. You've done away with the arsonist behind many of the fires of the Middle East. If by solving that one thing, you open the management toolbox to deal with all of the other things that have long existed in the Middle East. So I don't believe the Trump administration sees it that way yet. But
Yeah.
I think talking about decapitating military leadership, not talking, but basically hinting that there will be a gigantic failed state in the heart of the Middle East with 86 million people, many of whom are pro-American, pro-Israeli. That to me seems to be the height of irresponsibility, to
Yeah.
do that while thinking you can pivot and not have to deal with this region anymore, and not deal with environmental and economic and political and military, let alone real human issues. And that's why the attempt to avoid the regime change conversation actually is handicapping the necessary political work to see how Iran is trying to buy time, to see where their diplomatic strategy is at, and to see what you will need to balance with when it comes to Middle Eastern threats that are military, economic, and political, with much more bigger, costlier, and challenging Eurasian and East Asian threats.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, who's advising Tehran? I mean, as you've laid it out, they're in a bit of a corner here. Every day their leverage is in some way decreasing. And I want to talk about the economic side of that as well a bit later. But who's whispering in the ear of the Ayatollah outside of Iran? Anyone? Russia, China? Who might be looking to play a role in terms of how this all plays out with the Israelis and the Americans?
I honestly think not many people. Again, there is this axis of aggressors. There is Russia and China, but they see Iran as a pawn in their strategic competition with the West. Iran has been auditioning for great power support under the auspices of the Islamic Republic for many years now, since the mid 1990s. You can find from that time, Iranian talking points that sound like Putin talking points about NATO expansion. They have been auditioning for this cover because they want exactly that, the advice, the military stuff. And while no doubt they've gotten it in dribs and drabs. And really, it was only the post JCPOA, post Syrian civil war relationships that created the political space for the Iranians and the Russians to scale up to go to the strategic relationship they had with Ukraine. But we used to have a Russian colleague many, many years ago here at FTD. He was actually born in the Soviet Union. And he used to always tell me this phrase about Iran and Russia. And it was, there is no honor among thieves. Just because you bail your friend out doesn't mean your friend will come bail you out. And this is really the way a lot of partnerships work in the world. I mean, NATO and like real treaty allies, they are the aberrations to the norm in human history. So the Islamic Republic is alone. It's done a lot to put itself in that position to be alone. But those who it has coveted great power support and strategic support from will always have to balance with the other conditions. I mean, the Obama administration very cleverly got to the Chinese to act on their own mercantilist impulses, and in so doing, magnify the effect of U.S. secondary sanctions. The real art will be how to keep these two actors at bay to not empower Iran, rather than how do you how do you deal with this issue in a way that magnifies the existing Russo-Iranian and and Sino-Iranian ties. So Khamenei is alone, and not only is he alone, he is meeting people that he has not met with before. I mean, the military brain trust of the Islamic Republic is no longer there. People that he's been having meetings with for 15 years on a perhaps 2 to 3 times a week basis are not familiar faces in the room anymore. There was a joke made about the spokesperson for the Iranian military operation, like an exceptionally young guy. The joke was that this is a guy who has to still show his ID when he's trying to buy an illegal beer.
Yeah, so interesting. It's strategic on so many levels. How this is all playing out, but taking a step away from what's happening within the power structures within Tehran and elsewhere, uh, we should talk about the Iranian people. And you referenced some of the dynamics around a population that is not necessarily anti-American, not necessarily anti-Israeli, or at least to the levels that media might have us believe. But we're in a tricky moment, right? We have an administration that is less interested in pro-democracy type activities. Our foreign assistance restructuring is in its early stages. And I was thinking through this question about, if the regime falls, what does happen next in terms of how the U.S. might support populations that are naturally aligned and want to see something different, while recognizing that we're really bad at long wars. We're bad at nation building. We've proven that out in Afghanistan and Iraq. Maybe we've learned some lessons, maybe we haven't. But is this a real opportunity or a false opportunity, for the Iranian people? What are you thinking about in this regard, and what are you hearing?
The first thing I'm hearing, also just by virtue of being a first generation American of Iranian origin, I'm born and raised in the States, but both parents are immigrants by way of Iran, um, is a question of authenticity. Nobody wants to see, wherever you are on the pro or anti regime, obviously, vast sums of people, both inside and outside of Iran, on the anti regime side. Wherever you are, though, on that spectrum, the main prism, if you are inside Iran and you desire a better future and a fundamentally different government, the main prism that you see this conflict through, first and foremost, is your own survival. With Tehran, for example, being a city that is 10 million plus potentially, if you sprawl it out, Iranians have not been able to leave districts, even when the Israelis have been saying, this district, this time, please leave. Or when Trump has tweeted about the entire city, please leave. There's just been video after video of traffic jams and logs, and people being unable to escape to much more rural parts of the country, be it the north near the Caspian Sea, or a whole host of resort areas on the outskirts of Tehran proper. And that, coupled with the fact that there are no shelters, this is not something that the regime ever thought of was willing to invest in when it came to the home front, um, leads you to the position that you see today, which is sadly so many Iranians are just hunkered down in their buildings, or at best they'll go into mosques and tunnels and metro stations if they hear something or if they are told to run out. But you have a very tragic situation inside where you can't even get to have those conversations about what comes next, because the conversation is, do I get it tomorrow? And that is, just the human element of this conflict can never be forgotten. And while some very crassly are trying to link this to some kind of foreign imposed war, and Israel just trying to delay domestic politics by widening the front consistently, uh, that's a gross and moral mistake. This is Ali Khamenei's war. These are consistent wars of choice that Ali Khamenei has picked and, eerily enough, been winning in the past 2 decades of the post 9/11 Middle East. And that was the case up until the post October 7 Middle East, when Israel began to slowly reverse the tide, disconnect the dots, deal with the proxies, and is now dealing with the patron. I mean, you just have to see the hubris in the Iranian leadership here. No one is advising them. But I found a video from 2018. I posted it yesterday. The Iranian Supreme Leader gleefully saying, there will not be a war and we will not negotiate. Well, guess what? In 2025, under Trump term two, you were negotiating and there is a war.
Yeah.
Like, the Iranians have put themselves in this spot. And by Iranians, I mean the regime elite, the Islamic Republic's governing political, military, and security elite. And now for them to try to use for an 88-year-old man, the supreme leader of Iran, to try to use a nation of 86 million as a human shield, this is one of the most atrocious things to watch, from far away. My heart goes out first and foremost to those Iranians who desire a better life, but are stuck, quite literally stuck in this predicament, and see no path to be able to even begin to answer the questions you have.
Mhm.
But that's why what is happening on the ground matters. The conversation about Iranians applauding strikes initially is going to be moving to, how to deal with the casualty issue, and is
Yeah.
going to be moving to, well, can the Israelis potentially drive you in a direction to form some kind of domestic pressure vector? All of which, when you've seen in the history of boom and bust Iranian protests, have been organic. But in a world where the Israelis are quite literally striking the apparatus of repression of the regime,
Yeah.
that, I think, could be enough to give wind beneath the wings to some Iranians to get out there. But no Iranian will get out there while it's a war zone. No Iranian will get out there while the regime has a monopoly of violence, even at the neighborhood level,
Yeah.
with cameras and street thugs. And that's something the Israelis and the Americans need to know as they think about potentially driving this to the next step. I certainly think the longer DC keeps saying that there's a hangover from Iraq, and then doesn't deal with the reality of, if ever there was a place to have a regime change policy, it would have been Iran, not anywhere else where the U.S. has tried it. That is really one of the tragedies of U.S. foreign policy in this region, since really, again, the 21st century, since really 9/11. I know I
Mhm.
didn't answer your question about the assistance and the logistical things that need to come, but this is the time when the Americans need to be, at least from a sanctions perspective,
Yeah.
designating everybody who's anybody on a human rights side. Again, you need to look for ways to put wind beneath the wings. This is when those U.S. government media outlets, VOA, Radio Farda, whatever, need to be at their A game. And frankly, they're not. The US government has restored part of VOA Persian, but has not brought back the consultants. Radio Farda surrogate reporting has been good in some places, deplorable in some other places, okay in some other places. This is when everyone needs to be at their A game. This was an eventuality because of the way Ali Khamenei has been playing to the edge for 2 decades. And the fact that no one is ready for it, being from some elements in the Iranian opposition to some, well wishers in cyberspace to even some foreign governments, is a massive indictment of everybody. But you can't keep finger wagging while there is a war going on. You kind of emotively foot stomp that, because I do believe, like FED says, that you have to do things, not just think about them. And One thing the US could be doing is now trying to break some of the internet censorship holds that the regime is trying to put out there. What they could do is actually highlight the things that are struck and translate why these things that are struck are of import for those who seek a better life in Iran. I mean, going after the national TV station, which has been airing tortured confessions of Iranians and even foreign nationals for many years, I think that is low hanging fruit. To describe why going after the Tehran police headquarters, that is low hanging fruit for Iranians. These things need to be consistently kind of put out there, and they're not, whether it should be from the Israelis or the Americans. And conversely, to think cleverly from a sanctions perspective, how to put wind beneath the wings of Iranians, and from a cyber perspective, how to dismantle the apparatus of repression that exists, the street cameras, the VPN filtering. There is a real electronic element to this conflict that would do a heck of a lot to those forces who are seeking change in Iran, but again, are not going to be able to act on it like in the middle of a shooting war.
This question of max pressure on Iran and what that should look like now that we're in this kinetic moment. And we might be thinking about secondary sanctions and tariffs, more sanctions on Chinese oil refineries, for example, or the recipients of a lot of sanctioned Iranian oil, efforts economically to sever Iranian Russian supply chains, particularly critical defense supply chains. So, what's your thinking on what a max pressure strategy should look like? Is there a role for it? Number one, and then number two, how do we need to pivot? You mentioned, we should be sanctioning on a much broader scale. I agree with that. What else? What else should we be doing?
For too long, I think U.S. policy has seen this as an or question. It's diplomacy or max pressure or strikes or. Now we really have to see it as a cocktail approach. There is a military element. The Israelis are doing obviously the lion's share of that. There is a communications element that I think that the U.S. government, particularly through those media outlets, does indeed need to step up. On the max pressure side, just because there is something of a kinetic conflict going on doesn't mean that you should be taking your foot off of the gas there. If you want to magnify the impact of the strike, you should still be going after those major sources of revenue, as well as those industries, as well as those persons, banks, and businesses that have long formed the sanctions busting campaign of the Islamic Republic. Particularly if you are 100% certain that you're not going after regime change, what you want to do on the back end of any limited military strike or potentially more expansive military strike that the Israelis have is to be able to limit and contain the ability of the regime to reconstitute. And by putting the regime in this tough spot, you could then help shape events on the ground or drive events on the ground by finding foreign pressure and domestic pressure, or macroeconomically bringing the walls in closer and closer on what's left of the regime elite post-conflict. So absolutely, there is a need to focus on all of the vectors of national security presidential memorandum 2 when it comes to the max pressure campaign. And then also to be able to scale that up with some things that, again, would put wind beneath the wings of protesting Iranians. There's a whole host of Magnitsky-esque designations, human rights, Glomax-style corruption things that now when the population is saying those which the regime invested in, the defense apparatus, the military apparatus, the nuclear infrastructure, is going up in smoke and didn't really do that well anyway, and that was money that should have been spent elsewhere. Now is the time to put the spotlight on those persons, those entities who really were instrumental in funneling cash away. There is a big room there, both on the political messaging side as well as the medium term to long term macroeconomic impact side. And especially if you marry that with the walls of max pressure still going in by nesting that into a larger series of sanctions and designations issues that we have with the Chinese. You guys at FDD at CEFP have been talking about the same things, which are ports, refiners, the refinery management leadership structure, the Chinese and other financial institutions that are processing payments or helping launder payments related to Iranian oil. All of these things need to be kind of humming along like an engine in the background to amplify the success of these strikes, and then to again limit and contain the ability of the regime to rebuild on the back end. Especially if you have no political ground game or no idea for what could come next politically. or if you want to shape the events that could come next politically. So I think this stuff is absolutely imperative. Obviously, it gets ignored at any time there's a shooting war. The other stuff gets ignored. Again, we have this or not and problem in Washington, and now is really the time for and.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to go one step further on max pressure sanctions and how banks need to be thinking about this risk and how it may be shifting. So one thing that has come up, which is kind of interesting, is that Iran's illicit networks includes those that have been set up to support proxy groups, including militia forces in Iraq. And the Central Bank of Iraq has prohibited US dollar transactions with several Iraqi banks due to these illicit finance concerns. It's something that Congress has been talking about. Should we be thinking about a more aggressive approach to banks in Iraq that are linked to Iran?
Exactly. Countries that engage in what we call the regional trade, whether that's Iraq, Turkey, Armenia, UAE, certainly Pakistan, maybe Oman, that have functioned to a certain degree at different points in time, obviously when it was not a shooting war going on, as more of an artery or a straw with which to breathe through and sustain and limp along different peak periods of American sanctions, do need to be at the forefront of that sanctions menu. I mean, Iraq matters a lot because we're moving into the summer. One of the waivers was already cut. I forget if it was for the electricity or for the gas. One was cut. I think one still remains. This should be high on the docket for USG to try to address. You're moving into the summer period, which is also the period where you already have electric and other energy issues anyway. So there's a real real desire for the U.S. to stand by its word when it says if it's going to be cutting waivers, it'll help you find an alternative that can actually help keep some goodwill with the Iraqi people. And then to realize that these things will have short-term to medium-term effects inside of Iraq, because if the Islamic Republic really does feel like it's going down, that potentially might be when some of these militias will step up because of how fragile Iraq is, because of this mixed relationship Baghdad and central authority in that country has with the U.S., and of course because there will be elections, I think, in the late fall of this year in Iraq as well. So it's time to see these arteries that the regime has within Iraq and be able to crush them and restrict them as well. And again, the same thing applies. This is especially the case if you are not intent on trying to build a different political order, or if you do want to drive to create in the medium to long term a different political order, to go after the host of bad actors that have helped sustain the current bad order.
Yeah.
So everything that you're saying, I think, also needs to be happening at kind of the hum level, the low intensity, steady stream level of the USG. The challenge is, of course, limited time, limited human power, and limited resources. Which ones get prioritized? I think in the macro world, when it comes to oil and major ways that the oil money is laundered, you want to look at Hong Kong and UAE, Malaysia and China. In the regional trade, you want to look at Iraq.
So I want to switch to the broader economic equities, the economic strategy. Um, so there are people writing deep, I would say, in the Substack about the notion that what's happening right now in the Middle East is much more about a fight for the future economic order for the region than it is about the threat of nuclear annihilation. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I'd love to get your view on how Iranian elites see these strikes from an economic perspective, if at all, and pose the question, do Iranian elites see the strikes as part of a larger regional order being shaped against them? For example, normalization with Arab states through the Abraham Accords. And one more question, which could be kind of a crazy idea, but I'm going to throw it out anyway. Do you think that Iran and America could ever become economic allies?
The latter one, let me address first. If you have a fundamentally different kind of government in Iran, I think you will have a fundamentally different kind of political relationship with that entity in Tehran and with the USG. The question obviously is what kind of order, because, as much as I would like to be an optimist as an Iranian American, just also as an analyst and a Middle East watcher more broadly, the rule of the Middle East is things get worse, not better. And it takes a heck of a lot of human agency and planning and capital to be able to overcome the barriers that have traditionally impeded these things, which are much more structural, especially in a place like the Middle East. So, yes, absolutely. If you flip the script and you get even a more representative government, or a government that puts the national interest first, notice I did not even use the word democracy, as we are, even as we are both colleagues in the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. But even if you begin to facilitate the creep to get to democracy, even in that period, you will have significant room for the US. I mean, flipping the script on the Ayatollahs actually is opening, creating the script, creating the political space to open for a different US Iran economic relationship that actually could do what the Ayatollahs have been tempting Trump to do, which is to see Iran as really one of the last not still globally integrated economies in the world. And that, I think, should go to the forces of freedom rather than to the acts of aggressors who will continuously pick at the carcass of Iran and cannot tolerate like a strong, sovereign, independent Iran. That has indeed great potential, but that potential can only really come if you really are coming out of this conflict successfully and with a political vision that you can align resources towards and help drive. So that is the potential alliance question. And on the other one about how the Iranians see the region, you don't need to go into deep Substack world to see that. Although there are very interesting things in deep Substack world, it's kind of like a
There
much more
are.
intellectual, deep Wikipedia world.
That's right.
What kind of a rabbit hole you can go down. But the Iranian political, economic, military elites have always seen the region arrayed against them. That is not new. They've always seen, whether you're a state or a non-state actor or a bank or a business, they've always seen that someone is out to get them. I mean, even look at the way a place that they had invested significantly militarily, but were unable to economically get something out of it. And that was Syria. Really from 2018, 2019, you saw a lot in the Iranian press from Iranian political officials who have visited Syria and were lamenting that even though they had done the lion's share to try to keep Assad in place and stabilize, quote unquote, stabilize, even though they created massive refugee issues, terrorism issues, depopulation, all of that, as much as they did that, they wanted to reap the economic dividends. They wanted something predatory so that they could extract on the back end, and they failed to extract. So there is this, someone is always out to get us kind of conspiratorial thinking, but it's also conditioned by them having been beaten in the official game. Because in a place like Syria, for example, they were complaining about the efficacy of the Turkey's foreign economic policy towards that, post towards that Assad regime post 2015, 16, 17 order that was back in Damascus again. So this is the more kind of revisionist, revolutionary, and then into conspiratorial thinking that exists. I don't think the fact that the dollar really does have all of this strength and that the dollar has been a weapon of war against them for so long, that also has kind of bled into this conspiratorial thinking. But again, the dollar has been able to be weaponized against them for so long because they have been the one, again, when I say this is Ali Khamenei's war, they have been the one opting into these conflicts when they know economically and even militarily they are outgunned. So you can't really cry over spilt milk if you kept filling the milk glass all the way and trying to push the glass over because you wanted to look tough.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I want to end on one final question, and it goes back to where the Israelis are positioned from an economic perspective. Uh, a lot of the geopolitical risk that has weighed down the Israeli economy, its ratings, the ability to attract potentially more foreign direct investment, is linked to the Iran threat. And systematically, those geopolitical risks are really being dealt with, mostly in the last week, but of course, a lot of build up to that. But how do you see the opportunity going forward as, hopefully we're going to get to some, well, we don't know where we're going. If it's more war, negotiation, some combination, we don't know. But Israel is a healthy economy. They've had very strong growth that has actually continued through the war. Their credit ratings are actually pretty strong. And I think, if they're successful in terms of dealing with the nuclear threat in particular, it will really be a boost for Israel and potentially the region. But what do you think that should look like in terms of Israel's role in a broader economic framework for the region? Is it picking up again on the Abraham Accords? Is it something different? Is it some combination of thinking around the IMEC, Israel, Middle East, Europe, supply chain corridor and regional integration with Europe and India? What does it look like from your perspective?
All of that is where Israeli, again, I want to use this word that I used about Turkey. I think Turkey, unfortunately or unfortunately, depending on where you stand or sit in life, does this really well. But Israel has the opportunity, if it comes out of these different cycles of violence, to really reshape its foreign economic policy as being one that also is engaging deeper with the East as it is with the West. Again, talk about Abraham Accord expansion, talk about doubling down if you really do get some kind of ceasefire or truce or peace or different kind of order in Gaza, whatever you want to name it. There is really the potential for a scaling up of the deep social, political, and economic ties that they were able to build with some of the GCC countries during the Abraham Accords, expand that out. IMEC, I think, so long as there's a major missile war and shooting war, you have to really see that as a pipe dream. But if the Israelis are partners with the Americans on really flipping the script and being able to drive a different political order, or perhaps better yet, help shape those forces on the ground who want a different kind of political order, then they too, just like the Americans, can be, just like the Dean Acheson memoir, present at creation for just when that largest state in the region is flipped and becomes a much more positive builder of things in the region rather than a destructive power. Up until then, I think the Israelis will be, for the short term, in at least for another week or so, I think, in a shooting war with the Iranians. Much will depend on how they get how America will come in. Will they enter? Will the Americans enter as more of a deconflictor? Will they enter as really someone who will deliver the coup de grace, if you will? Or will they enter as really part of a larger Israeli counterproliferation campaign, which could mean the conflict will go on, which means that the talk that we're having now about the economic integration will be on pause? Because I think even though the regime understands that if it widens the war, the Americans can deliver the death blow. They can move from counterproliferation to counter-regime, but nonetheless, there will be significant blows landed against GCC infrastructure, bases, what have you, which will have negative economic effects, which will put more distance and more time between what the GCC wanted and what the Israelis wanted, meaning this more integrated, cohesive regional economic order will, for the foreseeable future, be something aspirational and will be something that the Israelis will try to build vis-a-vis salami tactics with each country, with a different friendly order in each capital, but will always be on a shakier foundation so long as there is, again, this shooting war. I know that is very cautious. It's neither cautious optimism nor cautious pessimism, but it really is designed to stress we're not out of this yet.
Yeah, yeah, great. Behnam, thank you so much. We've covered a lot in the last 50 or so minutes, and I just want to thank you for all your good work. And I hope you'll come back and join us again on Coercive Capital. Thank you so much.
It'd be a pleasure. Thank you so much. And it's great to have you and the whole CFP team as colleagues here. Thanks a lot.